You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 46.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Stephen Callahan's boat, the Napolean Solo, capsized in the Atlantic Ocean, several hundred kilometres off the west coast of Africa. Steve spent the next 2.5 months in an inflatable rubber life raft at the mercy of the winds and currents, and shares what it was like facing starvation, extreme hunger, exposure, and the overwhelming desire to fight for survival. Steve's book, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, went on to become a New York Times bestseller. Steve also served as the primary consultant on Ang Lee's Oscar-winning shipwreck movie, Life of Pi. Enjoy the interview. Stephen Callahan, welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've been a lifelong sailor. Is that right?
That's right. I've been sailing. I'm in my 60s now. I've been sailing over 50 years anyway.
How did you sort of get into it, from the beginning? Did you live like on the water or near the water at all?
Well, my family dug out what was an old lake bed that was spring fed, and I grew up with a pond sort of in the backyard. I spent a lot of time messing around with that, but really I started sailing thanks to my Boy Scout master, who had a small boat, and he was a lifelong sailor, and he would take kids out sailing with him if they were interested, and I basically just fell in love with it from the time I was like 11 or so, and became very passionate about it, while a lot of other kids my age, were interested in cars or something like that. I was only kind of consumed by boats and the ocean and all of that, so that really is what got me into it.
Yeah. And you're based in Maine, on the east coast of America. Is that where you grew up?
Well, I grew up in Massachusetts, just south of here, outside of the burbs of Boston. And so I sailed along the coast there, and I got to know the Maine coast basically through sailing. This guy with whom I would end up sailing for years, and into my college years, really. We used to sail up here. At first, we had a little camp cruiser and brought it up here and kind of sailed around the islands. It's a very beautiful coast here. Lots of more than 3,000 islands. Very crinkly coastline with lots of bays and inlets and whatnot. It's a beautiful place to be. So. When I got out of school, I was wandering around helping people build boats. And when we decided to look for a place to land ashore a bit, we loved the coast of Maine, so we ended up here.
As you're starting to get into sailing and you're learning the ropes, is it similar? Is it like an apprenticeship? Like I don't really know much about sailing, but, with trades like a plumber or an electrician, someone new that's coming on board learns the trade and learns the ropes from the master, I guess. Is that similar to sailing, where you actually learn the ropes and you're like an apprentice to the skipper, I guess?
Sometimes. I guess the roads into things are quite varied, especially sailing. Some people grow up, they're kind of, their parents belong to a yacht club. They come from generations of sailors and, they're introduced to it that way. In my case, I just happened to know this guy who was a sailor, and he liked going off on the ocean. And because nobody really in my family sailed at all. My parents came from coal mining country in Virginia, and my father loved the ocean, but they weren't really sailors or anything. So for me, it was a bit of happenstance. Yeah. But I was dedicated to it, and I think if you're dedicated to anything, you kind of find a way in. Yeah. Often, though, if you're getting on boats, other people's boats, you are in a crewing position, and you kind of learn the ropes from people who've done it before. So in that way, it's very much an apprenticeship. The guy who taught me to sail was really a good mentor in that he would let me do everything I possibly could do and wanted to do, from planning trips to navigating. And I spent a lot of time kind of growing up in the woods where I grew up. It was a lot of woods and camping in the mountain, doing some mountain climbing and that sort of thing. I felt very comfortable in those kind of wilderness environments. And that's what really attracted me, was to go away from humankind and into this amazing wilderness called the ocean.
Yeah. Do you remember your first sailing trip, like big sailing trip, either out into the ocean or down or up the coast? Do you sort of remember your first one?
Well, what we used to actually from, he had like the first boat I really sailed was just like a 15-foot day sailor. And we would go out and we would just sail until we lost sight of everything. So that was sort of early on when I was, 11 or something like that, 11 or 12. And and then we would take steps from there. You start doing overnights, and then you do a 200-mile trip and so on. But I think one of the fundamentally changing trips for me was our first offshore trip, which was after I got out of college. I built a 28-foot trimaran and was living on it, and we entered a race from Newport to Bermuda. And so we did that, three of us, and then sailed the boat back. And when we got back, I just felt like I had just been in this totally different space, and I wouldn't have minded just turning right around and going right back out there again. So that really, it was a sort of an earmark trip.
Yeah. Yeah, when you mentioned Newport, that sort of triggered a memory for me. In I think it was 1983 or 82, when Australia won the America's Cup.
Right.
And I think it was from Newport, Rhode Island, around there somewhere, or Bermuda. I'm not sure. I think it was.
Yeah, probably. It would have been in Newport. Newport was the capital of the America's Cup for generations, really, until it was won by you folks down under.
Now, how many knots do you know? Do you know heaps of knots? Like the sailing knots, and do you need to know heaps?
Well, one thing that attracted me to sailing was that it's really kind of an endless endeavor, and to be a great sailor, especially like an offshore shorthanded sailor, you really need to know at least a little bit about an awful lot of things, and it helps to know as much as possible about them. I mean, everything from oceanography, and you have to have some sort of basic understanding of mechanical forces and physics and mathematics. And, especially back in that era when I was first sailing offshore, we had no long range communications. We didn't know where we were all the time. We navigated by sextant and sometimes guessing how fast the water was going by the boat and plotting things out and those sorts of things. So it was a really different world. You were in some ways tuned into the natural world more than we often do today with all the instrumentation and whatnot. It was just a different time, and I love that. Although I also love the modern gadgetry. Yeah. So. I don't know. I can't. I kind of lost the plot. What was the original question?
Oh no, I was just mentioning about the America's Cup and knots.
Oh, knots. Yeah. Yeah. I know quite a few knots. I can do a lot with rope. And it came in very handy later on when I would be shipwrecked, because you kind of living like a caveman. And I was pretty good at with caveman kind of technologies with a knife and some rope and whatnot. You can go out and, live out of a backpack for a long period of time, or, at sea, often things are going wrong and breaking. And you're kind of learning how to live in an isolated environment with limited resources. So you have a lot of sort of those kind of practical skills, hopefully.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you or you've built a number of boats. Tell us about Napoleon Solo, and did you build that?
Yeah, I designed and built the boat. I was at the time I'd been building boats, and then I kind of transitioned into design. Was working in a design school and design office here in Maine, which gets back to your apprenticeship question. Actually, that especially at the time was very much an apprenticeship type of business, and I wanted to cross the ocean from the time I was, like 12 or something or other in a small boat, either by myself or with somebody else. And so this mini Transat race came up, and I decided I would build a boat that would fit into that, which means it basically was, 21 feet long. And on that, I would sort of fulfill all these childhood dreams of crossing the ocean. So I built it with the help of a friend of mine, Chris, who would end up meeting me in Bermuda and sailing the rest of the way across the Atlantic in Napoleon Solo with me.
Yeah. And was that the first Atlantic crossing that you'd done?
Yeah, that was my first crossing, yeah.
Yeah, that would have been an adventure, doing that.
It was a great adventure. It's not that the ocean hadn't been crossed by small boats before, but it certainly wasn't very common. And I was very interested in one thing I love about boats is they're a kind of unique combination of machine and habitat and vehicle and art all in one thing. And just organization, the spaces, the efficiency of a boat is something I always loved. And so this was an attempt at designing a small boat that you could actually live on for relatively long periods of time. I was quite comfortable in the boat. I could have lived on that boat sort of permanently, even though it was only 21 feet long.
Now, so you sailed solo across the Atlantic, and where did you end up? Was it in the UK?
Yeah, like I say, I sailed solo to Bermuda to qualify for this mini Transat race. Yep. And had some trouble on the way, lost the mast, had to re-rig. I had to jury rig and bring the boat back and re-rig the boat and sail it back to Bermuda again. And then Chris met me there, and we sailed it the rest of the way across, stopping in the Azores, and then finally Penzance, England, from where the mini Transat would start.
So what you were, the actual transatlantic race, was that starting in Penzance, was it?
Yeah.
So you sailed to the start, you sailed across the Atlantic to the start, and then you were going to go back the same way?
No, you go back a different way. The mini Transat at the time ran from Penzance south to the Canary Islands, just off the coast of Africa. And then from the Canaries, you kind of drop down, get into the trade winds, and blow across to the Caribbean, and in Antigua.
So how long were you there in England? Like you'd done that crossing. How long were you in England, and what sort of maintenance was required on the boat after the first sort of crossing? Is there much sort of stuff that you need to do to maintain it and sort of fix up little bits and pieces here and there?
Well, I try to keep up with things on the boat, any little things that needed to be done. We were pretty conscious about that. Like I said, I lost the mast on the way to Bermuda the first time. So we had one job is I put these sort of reinforcing struts on the mast in England, which just sort of made the bottom of it bulletproof. But otherwise, I had some things to sort out. Some things never worked properly. It was an early era for solar panels, and they never worked properly and whatnot. But generally, the boat was in pretty good kit when I got there, because if you're sailing the boat, you're seeing things that are going wrong and whatnot. The boat was pretty well shaken down, as we say, by the time I got to England. But we had a bit of work. I think we were there for a couple of weeks, but it was stressful.
Yeah. Now, tell us about when you departed from England. Step us through that. as you're coming back, from England?
Okay, well, there's this whole collection of little boats going in this race. I can't remember the exact number, but it's in the late. It started in the late fall. In the North Atlantic is not benign in its best of times, and in the fall it can get pretty gnarly. So there were bad forecasts basically, and we left England and sort of bounced our way down to the Bay of Biscay, which is quite notorious in its own right. And by that time, they actually lost, I can't remember how many boats, several boats. One had turned over and didn't come up right. An Italian I passed actually lost his boat. I didn't realize he was in trouble. I was trying to raise him on the radio and whatnot, and ended up sailing by him. And I heard later he had been picked up, but the boat had been lost. And I ended up having some damage in the Bay of Biscay, bouncing over these big waves, and it looked like I had hit something. So I retired from the race in La Coruña and spent quite a lot of time there, probably a month, because it was like every day was a gale. Every day. You have to get around the Cape Finisterre, which is pretty nasty. So I ended up hanging out there and then ending up cruising the boat down along the coast of Spain and Portugal, out to Madeira, down to the Canaries, which was fantastic. It was like stepping back 100 years in a lot of these places. We were in this little boat into places that, they hadn't seen a yacht in years.
Oh, really?
Like that. Yeah, it was very cool. And so I basically followed, the race. I was going home at this point. I was broke. I didn't have anything except what was on the boat. And so got to the Canaries and was getting ready to make my crossing the same way, basically. And I figured that once I got to the Caribbean, I'd get work with a friend of mine at a boatyard there and see what the next chapter would bring.
So just for listeners, the Canaries is just off the coast of Morocco?
Africa.
Africa.
Yeah. They kind of stretch out from very close to the northwest coast there, and they stretch out quite far into the ocean. And I, was leaving from the more western parts of the islands.
Yeah. So when you departed from the Canaries, tell us about the when you departed and the main day that sort of changed your life.
Yeah, well, so it was January, the end of January. It was getting a little cool. We were still in the sort of northern hemisphere there, and I wanted to finally get going. I'd spent quite a while in the Canaries, made friends there, really enjoyed time there, and set off. It actually had a beautiful week of sailing, just downwind sailing, and I was doing exercises and drawing and reading, and it was unusual in that it was so pleasant. Because a lot of times on a boat, people think on a boat it's pleasant all the time. A lot of times it's not very pleasant. You may appreciate it, but it's not always easy. And but a storm was kind of brewing up about a week into it, and it didn't look like it was anything horrendous. And the boat and I had been through several gales before and whatnot. It was pretty well shaken down, so we thought, I thought it was, going to be fine. And but I kept looking around, and it got dark, and the waves were probably about, my guess is sort of significant wave height was probably about 3 meters, more or less. And we're scooting down over these waves, and I kept getting up and making sure everything was okay. And finally I lay down and took off all my clothes, which was a little bit of a mistake. And sort of local middle of the night, there was a big bash in the side of the boat, and I knew immediately that the boat was doomed because the water was just like pouring in, like, fire hoses in.
Really?
And so I leapt up and, basically got my gear together as best I could. But the boat looked like it was going straight down. So I had a big bag full of equipment and stuff. I left that behind. I just got up on the deck and got a life raft and inflated and floated off the side of the boat. and because I thought the boat was just going down like a rock. But once I got in the raft, I was still tied to the boat, and it was clear that the boat was stabilized. I had some watertight compartments in it, and the way it was going down, it also developed an air pocket, and so it kind of stabilized with all these waves washing over it. But it wasn't. It seemed like it was kind of stable there. So I got back on the boat, dove down inside, made a bunch of as many trips as I could physically to get my gear bag and some other odds and ends and get in the life raft. And but the raft was really light and kind of bobbling around on the water, and breaking waves would hit it, and it's tied to this boat full of water, which is like being tied to the bottom of the ocean almost. It's and so it'd be like being in an auto accident every once in a while. And finally, just before daybreak, a big wave hit the raft, but this time it kind of scooted off and seemed a lot more peaceful. And I looked out and was floating away from the boat. So basically at that point, I was pretty much in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and I was drifting downwind about 1,800 nautical miles, about 2,000 statute miles, to drift to the Caribbean, which would take 2.5 months.
Do you know what you hit? Was it debris or something? Or?
There's a lot of debris floating around out there. Right now there's a single-handed round-the-world race going on, and I think out of 30 boats, I think 5 or 6 have already hit something in the water hard enough to do damage. We call them UFOs, for unidentified floating objects. Yeah. I think in my case, it seemed like the blow came from the side. My presumption was always that it could have been a whale or some other large sea animal, big shark or something, I mean, sometimes they get a couple of tons, and, they're swimming along, minding their own business, and you're kind of swimming along, minding your own business, and you're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So was it literally just like a massive bang, and then that just woke you up immediately, and then at the same time you just saw all this water pouring into your boat?
Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
What, you were just acting on instinct straight away just to... What were you feeling?
Pretty much. Like, I wrote this book called Adrift about it, and in there I kind of go into detail about, you kind of... to me, at least, I had all these voices in my head going on at the same time. There's part of me that's just really freaked out and screaming, "You got to die!" And there's part of me going about the business that I needed to go about. Getting the gear together and trying to focus as much as possible on that and not on these other voices. Part of me was even amused. The camera had come on somehow in the back of the boat and was taking this really dramatic footage, which I thought was sort of ironic. And so. You're kind of thinking about a lot of things. Your heart's going a million miles an hour, and you're certainly scared. But through it, I dealt with enough stuff in my life, I think, and sailing's pretty good training to focus you on dealing with what needs to be dealt with, no matter what your emotions are doing. So I was lucky in that regard, and it allowed me to get out of the boat. But then the first kind of stage of survival voyage after that impact and escaping that immediate threat is one of kind of disorientation in longer term anxiety and fear and all that, because you don't know how to make a life in this new environment at all. I was in this like little floating rubber tent, and I had some tools and stuff, and I had some knowledge, but there's a big difference between having that and adapting to, as I called it, living like an aquatic caveman.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you had to dive back under a number of times to get whatever you could get. What did you manage to get your hands on as you were diving back under into the boat to retrieve stuff? Was there anything specific you were trying to get, or what did you end up grabbing onto?
Well, the priority was to get my ditch kit, which was a bag full of all kinds of little goodies. I had a lot of flares, flare gun. I had knives. I had bits of rope and twine, fishing stuff. I had Fortunately, had bought a very small spear gun that just fit into this bag in the Canary Islands before I left. I had solar stills that at least theoretically should produce fresh water out of salt water, and stuff like that. The raft had a little bit of equipment in it. It also had some of this stuff. I also had an emergency transmitter, and things like that. And then after I got that out, then I don't know, it was basically anything I could grab hold of, which included a cushion, a sleeping bag, and some other stuff like that.
So the actual ditch kit, was that like the size of like a gym bag type thing?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. What did the Life Raft, what does that look like? How big was it? And you said it was like a floating tent. Was it sort of rubberized or?
Yeah, it's a reinforced rubber material, at least in that era. And it's like a couple of big inner tubes, one stacked on top of the other, with a 16th inch rubber floor running across the bottom, and a little tent stretched across the top, essentially. So it's like a little cave, floating cave.
Your boat, was that at night when it sunk?
Yes.
And then what happened? Like, tell us the next day, like, you know, as the sun starts to come up, and what, did you cut the tie from the raft to the boat?
No, that something in the linkage there broke. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't my choice to drift off. I'd kind of hoped to stay with the boat till morning to get, be able to get back aboard, get more water at least, and stuff like that. But once I was broken away from it, it's, everything's a kind of a two-edged sword, or, it's got a yin-yang balance to it. And so in some ways it was good that I broke away from the boat, because there's a good chance that I stayed with it, the raft could have come apart in all those breaking seas. Yeah. But on the other hand, I didn't have all the stuff that I would like to have had, and I was in the middle of the Atlantic in this teeny little life raft. But it was gray. It was dismal for several days. It blew really hard. I almost tipped upside down several times. I was soaking wet. It was really cold at night. It was staying warm enough at night was a real problem. Yeah. All those things. It was pretty dreadful. And then, psychologically, beating myself up for, getting myself into this situation and every mistake I'd ever made. And, you really, it's a pretty grim period, frankly. Yeah. But it takes a while to work your way through it, to deal with the problems, to figure out how to make water and catch food and all that other stuff. And for me, that took at least a couple of weeks.
So tell us, how far were you from land at this point? Sort of like on day one on the life raft, how far were you from land? And I'm guessing with the currents, you would have been drifting away from land back towards America.
Yeah, the Cabo Verde Islands, I think, were about maybe in 600 to 800 miles south of me. I left the Canary Islands, which were east of me by about 800 miles. And where the current and the wind would take me was like 1,800 nautical miles roughly. Yeah. And, the raft drifts across the water a little bit, but current also takes you that way. So I just had to wait it out.
What was your first priority on day one? Like you've just lived through an incredibly traumatic experience, surviving a shipwreck, and your boat goes down and you're on a life raft. What are you thinking pretty much on day one or the next morning when the sun comes up in terms of survival? What was your first thing? Was it fresh water, or what were you sort of thinking? How were you sort of prioritizing what you needed to do next?
Well, like I say, I really couldn't do very much for several days because it was pretty stormy out. I mean, it was nice to have daylight, but I didn't really see the sun for a while. Basically familiarize myself with stuff. The first thing I did, even before drifting off, was immediately tie everything into the boat, because if you lose a piece of gear, that could result in your death. So If the boat got, if the raft got tipped upside down or something, I didn't want to lose anything. I organized my gear as best I could. And the first thing is to stay warm enough, because hypothermia can kill you in minutes to hours. So that's the first thing. Once I got that kind of dealt with at least on a minimal level, the next priority would be, besides keeping the raft, I have to pump up the raft, look for any signs of any problems, try to deal with those. I had a couple little patches I had to make, things like that. But then after that, it's water. And it took me a long time to figure out how to get water. I had almost no rainfall, so that was the big challenge for the first couple of weeks. And slowly but surely, everything that floats around in the ocean becomes an island, develops an ecology. So fish started gathering around the raft after a few days, and eventually I would certainly need food. So that would have been the next priority. But it's kind of a mix of all those things. And every day I'd get up and I'd try to, go through my mind and, determine what should be prioritized today, what needs the most attention.
Yeah. Tell us about the process of getting fresh water. How did you do that? G'day guys, Matt here. This podcast is a labour of love, and all episodes are researched, scheduled, edited, created and promoted in my spare time. Typically, after an episode has been recorded, it can take another 3 hours of post-production activities to get the final cut. If I'm providing you with value and you wish to support my vision of sharing these inspirational stories to the world, you can do so at borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. Your support will help to maintain the monthly podcast running costs and enable me to outsource repetitive tasks so I can bring you even more kick-ass episodes. Once again, if you want to support me in producing this podcast, head over to borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. You can't miss it. And now back to the rest of the show. Tell us about the process of getting fresh water. How did you do that?
Eventually, I would evolve better water catchment systems when I would have a little bit more rain. But I had almost no rain for the first couple of months, and so I relied on these solar stills that were produced for downed airmen during the Second World War. And they're these balloon-like affairs. They're basically a little environment, a little atmosphere. You drip salt water down on the top, and that evaporates off of a black cloth that's suspended on the inside, and it collects on the inside of this balloon, and that fresh water kind of rains down on the inside into a collection bag, which is fine in theory, but they had to be inflated just the right amount. I couldn't use them in the ocean as directed. It took me a while. One kept getting torn apart by the waves, and I finally cut it up to figure out, kind of how it was made and figure out a way of using it, which was basically to tie it on the raft, keep the bottom wet. I had to tend to them like every 15 minutes or so to make sure that they could produce. But they eventually, it would be drip, drip, drip. And in a good day, I could maybe produce just over a pint, somewhere around there. On a bad day, hardly anything.
During this time that you're trying to get your water situation sorted over many days or weeks, and only managing to get like a pint maybe on per day of drinkable water, you would have had to have drunk a lot of seawater as well. Did you?
No,
you didn't drink any.
No, I was always warned away from that. And, although there are some people who insist, you can drink some seawater, it doesn't hurt you and whatnot. It's really not good. It doesn't really rehydrate you because of the salt content's higher than the salt content within your cells. So eventually it dehydrates you more. Yeah. You have plenty of fresh water. It doesn't hurt you to drink some salt water, but in those situations it wouldn't have helped. And so I was very conscious of that. Fortunately, in my survival gear, I did have 8 pints of water, so that gave me a little window of opportunity. I was always really thirsty and dehydrated through the entire trip, but I was lucky that I was able to bruise basically just enough to keep one person alive.
Was there much shade on the boat? You mentioned there was a tent sort of canopy type thing. How sort of thin or thick was that material? Did it provide enough shade, or was there much shade at all that you had?
It actually was helpful. It's a fairly thin material, but it's reinforced fabric. It's got a coating on, a bright orange coating, which unfortunately would kind of come off as the canopy got basically waggled around by the wind and whatnot, and would come off in water when it did rain. I was collecting off the canopy, made it absolutely undrinkable. It was like drinking vomit or something or other. It was just really horrible. And so I had to make a system to actually go over that canopy to collect rainwater. But it provided enough shade that you could see light through it, but not bright sun. But also, I'd been sailing in the kind of mid latitudes to tropics for almost a year, and I was pretty brown. I wasn't worried about being sunburned. The bigger issue is dehydration than actual sunburn.
Tell us about your food situation. Did you have any food in your ditch kit or your life raft at all, stashed away?
I had a little bit of this, and I don't know. I think I had a can of peanuts, and I can't remember now exactly what I had, but it was just a few little items. I had a can of beans, which I had thrown in there at some point. But that by the time I got to that can was blown, and I didn't want to risk poisoning myself. So immediately I just chucked it out without about it. And I had a half a cabbage and I don't know, a few other things, but not really enough of anything. I had to live off the ocean. And so fish started arriving, and after a couple of weeks, I began catching fish. It just took a long time to get the technique right, and the fish are fast and a lot smarter than we give them credit for. So it took a long time.
In those couple of weeks, was it just a gradual decline in terms of your energy, your energy state, and your hunger just got more and more hungry every day and more dehydrated? Was it just sort of a gradual decline in terms of your overall health and well-being by being exposed to that situation?
Yeah, not just the first couple of weeks, but basically throughout the entire process. I mean, a lot happens pretty quickly. For one thing, it's common for survivors who spent, up to 2 to 3 weeks in a life raft or a lifeboat to lose a third of their weight. So you lose a lot of weight right away. And then your body has these mechanisms. It slows down your metabolism, changes it in starvation situations. And so after a while, you're losing less weight, per day. But you're basically in a chronic starvation mode and a chronic state of dehydration. And it takes its, kind of a long-term toll. Plus, there are other problems. I'm floating in a very salty environment, and water's in and out of the raft a lot. I'm wet a lot. If your skin is wet with salt water, you develop saltwater sores, which begin as kind of like little pimples on the skin, and they break open and then end up as, skin ulcers. And survivors, and some have horrible problems with them. They were a constant irritation and source of huge pain. I ended up with hundreds of them. And so you get more and more of everything as time goes on. It's kind of a slow, in Adrift, I called it a demo derby of flesh, I mean, basically that's it. You're kind of watching yourself die in front of your eyes, but at a very slow pace. So in the meantime, you just kind of get on with it, and do the best you can with what you got.
Tell us about how you actually caught fish, and it would have taken a while to get the process down pat. But how did you end up? What was your approach to catching fish to eat? How did you sort of do that? Did you have a net, or you mentioned you had a spear gun that?
Yeah, I had this little shorty spear gun. I tried catching the fish. There were two primary species around the raft. One were triggerfish, which were about a foot long or so, and they would come up close to the raft and kind of nibble at stuff trying to grow on the raft and whatnot. And then, but they didn't taste all that great, to be honest. They tasted pretty awful, and they were also a problem to catch. But the better fish were dorado, also known as mahi-mahi or dolphin fish. And those were big and very fast, very powerful. And the school would collect around the raft. As time went on, I looked at myself as like the mayor of Duckyville, my raft being Rubber Ducky. And all the fish were kind of the citizens of Duckyville. And I became quite familiar with them over time. And they seemed to gather, around the raft for some kind of unknown reason, really. But we know this happens with a lot of pelagic fish like tuna and whatnot. If there's a log floating around, they'll school around it. And so my raft was kind of that little island for them. And they would come up and hit the bottom of the raft. We're not really sure why they do this, but they do it, and it can be quite powerful. I had to be very careful if I laid my head down to make sure it was up on the bag or something like that, because they really would give it a whack. And they would come sometimes and brush the bottom of the raft, and so I used that to my advantage in the end. I figured out that if I pushed my knees down into this rubber floor, they would come up and brush against my knees, which would get them close to the entryway, where if I was quick enough, I might be able to get a spear into one. Yeah. But they would break the spear and whatnot. As the voyage lengthened, I'd end up tying it back together again. And, originally it was a spear that you would shoot, but the power strap disappeared. So then I had to lash it together, and eventually the tip disappeared, and I'd have to tie knives on it and whatnot. So it was a process that evolved over time, but basically that was it, was trying to lure them in, get them close enough to where I could jab a spear into them, and then try to be really careful as this huge fish is flying out of the water with a spear through its middle while I'm floating around in an inflated raft in the middle of the ocean. So it took a while to figure it all out.
You mentioned a while ago, and I've heard on other interviews that you've done, you likened that experience to like a caveman mentality or a caveman almost like lifestyle. What was the feeling like, I guess, undoing the stuff that you'd been conditioned, undoing the stuff that we take for granted in normal life, like driving a car and paying bills and dealing with money and those sort of things. When you're shipwrecked, floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, having to create fresh water and stab fish with improvised, with knives attached to your blunt spear gun, what's that process like? Stripping away of your ego, stripping away of the things that you've been conditioned with over a lifetime, and coming back to the core of being a human being in the bare essence of survival mode. What's that sort of process like?
That's a good question. Well, I don't know. In a way, it was not really conceptually that much different than taking an ocean voyage, because, or any time you take a trip into the wilderness. I think one of the reasons I do those things, I've always been attracted to those things, is that you are immediately dwarfed by your surroundings in every way. You are a minor player there. It's very easy ashore to kind of get the idea that, that we're important and, everything's sort of human centric, but in the wilderness, it's totally not. So, and like I said before, sailing, especially a small boat in the middle of the ocean, you're very close to nature. With the Life Raft, it was that on steroids, obviously. And it was very, very basic. and it's kind of where, I don't know, it becomes sublime in many ways, because everything is important. Every moment is important. And that's similar to a lot of sport too. Like you said, you talk to a lot of extreme athletes. I've talked to a lot of people who've had survival experiences of various sorts, and people who are into kind of extreme sports. And a lot of people, I think, can relate to the moment, being in the moment. And in a situation like mine, every moment is important, and the tension can be unbearable and whatnot. But I don't know. What's important is reality. Is the sooner you can get over, kind of your ego or your just wishful thinking or whatever, and come to grips with what's real, then the sooner you can figure out, solutions to your problems and those sorts of things. And there's a kind of high on that. I mean, in the Life Raft, I found that, you go through all the human emotions, but the highs are incredibly high and the lows are incredibly low, and they can be just like jammed right up together. You can find a solution to a problem, like finally figuring out how to get the solar still to go. I mean, you feel kind of like you're the king of the world, and then something else happens, put a hole in the raft, or the spear gun breaks, and it's like, oh my God, I just don't know how much longer I can do this. It's a different kind of existence than normal, but it's hard to draw a line between it and life, or even normal life. I mean, to a certain degree, normal life is a survival voyage of its own.
Now, you would have been constantly on that knife edge of losing it mentally and remaining in a state of, or having that state of hope. What kept you going? What kept your spirit strong to try and continue to survive?
Well, fear was a part of it. I don't think I was ready to go, or at least not easily. It was no matter how awful it was at times, it was always easier somehow to go on, with probably one short exception, and towards the end of the voyage, where I felt like I almost had no more choice to go on. But overall, that was a part of it. Just a fear, a desire to kind of fix a lot of things in my life, to have a chance to come back ashore and, I don't know, live a better life in many ways than I had before. Was also another big part of it. Things people said to me, or people I'd run across in life. At least I was pretty well traveled, and I'd seen people in parts of the world who struggle their entire lives to survive. And somehow they not only do they do it, but they find room to smile and laugh and play. So it was a combination of a bunch of things. And certainly it was recognizing that so far so good. I've been lucky. Maybe I'll remain lucky. It's possible. I knew other people had been there before me. I'd read other, survival narratives before, and I knew it could be done. And slowly working at it. And, you start figuring it out, and you realize, okay, well, it took me a long time, but I did find a solution to this problem and that problem. And so now I have another problem, but that doesn't mean it's the end. Just keep plugging away, and maybe you will, if you're lucky enough, you'll get through it.
A lot of people have seen the movie Castaway. Did you have like a Wilson of sorts to sort of keep you sane?
Yeah, actually, I love that part of that movie. That made that movie real to me. We all need company. We often invent other people, and in Adrift, I kind of divide myself into almost three characters. I have a emotional me, and a physical me, and a rational me, and they all have different needs, and they squabble amongst themselves and reach compromises and whatnot. So I kind of had Wilsons within me, but the real Wilson in my story is the fish. Adrift really is a fishtail, and it's about the glory of nature and these fish that provided for me. Like I said, I named my raft Rubber Ducky. I was the mayor of Duckyville, and they were all my little citizens, and they were willing to sacrifice for me. But I had this I don't know. I held them in awe. They were kind of spiritual creatures to me, and they were my superiors in that domain. So I honored them and had to kill them, but I talked to them and whatnot. So they were kind of my Wilson, and they kept me going and thankfully accompanied me long enough to get me to the other end.
Were you really just at the mercy of the wind and the currents? Did you have any oars at all to sort of help row?
Well, I had two little paddles, but you can't really paddle a life raft except to maybe get away from a burning boat or something like that. You're certainly not going to paddle, 2,000 miles. So, and they're just for, kind of short-term use. I had a line out the back of the raft that I served to grow barnacles on and for food, and had a pole in the end of it, and it also kind of served as a speedometer. I made up a little speed distance table to know how fast I was drifting through the water. And Jesus, I've forgotten again what we were talking about. What were we talking about?
Oh, just the being able to steer your boat and maybe use paddles or oars to sort of.
That's right. I could kind of position that on the raft to encourage the tent to be used like more of a sail to encourage my drift a little bit south. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go as far south as I could because I was afraid of missing the Caribbean islands, and I got too far north.
Did you see any ships at all?
Yeah, I saw about 9 ships. The first couple were pretty close, but they never saw my flares or anything like that.
Tell us about how, towards the end of the this survival story, when did you tell us about the end part of it? Was it Guadeloupe that you started to approach?
Just off of Guadeloupe. On the 75th night, I'd been navigating. I kind of had an idea where I was, but I wasn't sure if my navigation was just all BS, frankly. But they eventually lights of the island showed up on the 75th night. And the next morning I was preparing. I had the little paddle, so I was thinking, maybe I can paddle my way around the side of the island, something like that, because landing on the windward side would have been deadly. There were coral reefs along the south shore. There was a beach behind them, but I didn't know if I could get over the coral reefs in order to get to the shore, because you have 3,000 miles of open Atlantic breaking on them. And the north side of the island were just all coral cliffs, so that was a no-go. And so I was getting kind of worried about, maybe this could be it. I get this far and it could be the end. But I thought I would wrap myself up in the bits of cushion I had and try to get these paddles to, kind of guide myself around the side of the island. And then I heard an engine, and these local fishermen came out, and they came out to find fish, and they found both me and the fish, which was kind of a welcome conclusion to the end. I knew that they had seen me because they waved back, so no longer was it just hope that some ship would stop by, that they actually were coming right at me and saw me. So I was pretty elated, to say the least. And what I didn't know exactly then, but which became clear very soon, was they came out to find me because of the ecosystem that had evolved around the raft. So these Dorado that surrounded me, they become my friends. They become my ocean gods, if you will. They nourished me. They almost killed me at one point by holding the bottom of the raft. And in the end, they brought my salvation. And so the fishermen came up. They were looking in the sky, saw birds hovering over the raft because the Dorado were there. And so they came out to find me.
Yeah. What was the look on their faces, when they sailed up to you and they saw you, you'd been adrift for 75 days or 76 days. You would have been full on beard, real skinny. What was the look on their face when they saw you?
Not sure if I can describe their faces exactly. I think that they were like curious and perplexed.
Yeah.
People go across, because it isn't a trade wind belt. A lot of crazy Europeans have floated across in all kinds of little boats, and one Englishman even went across in a modified barrel at some point, a specially designed modified barrel. And so I think they might have initially thought this must be some other fruitcake European guy coming here. But also we didn't have a common language really. One of them did speak English. He was from Dominica to the south, but with a really heavy accent. And I didn't really understand what they were saying because it wasn't like any language that I had ever really been familiar with. And it wasn't really Spanish or anything. It turned out it was Creole French, but it's very, very different from French. And, but he could understand me, this one guy from Dominica, and eventually we made ourselves understood. And I don't know, I just had, a lot of people are surprised, but I just had this, I was so in heaven, and I had carefully stocked water and fish sticks and all this stuff. And it was like, you guys got to fish. There are these great fish right here. So they buzzed around and fish for an hour or two until I got to what I call the afternoon bake-off, which was really hard for me to get through the really hot afternoon. And then they came and loaded me up with a raft, and we zoomed into the beach.
Yeah. When you got onto the beach, could you walk at all?
No. In fact, I was so anxious. They come around the backside of the island and kind of nose up onto this beach, but it's a pretty steep beach. And I almost just like hopped out over the side, and the guy grabbed my arm. He said, no, it's too deep here. Yeah, which would have been typical of me to have gone that far and, jumped off and drowned, 10 feet off the beach. But I scooted forward, and as soon as my feet hit that soft white Caribbean sand, it was like the earth was made out of concrete in a major earthquake, and I just fell flat on my face. Yeah. And these guys just grabbed me by the arms and lifted me up and basically just hoisted me up to the local gendarme. Yeah. Sat me in a chair.
Can you remember the first sort of 24 to 48 hours back on land? Was it just rehydrating and eating and sleeping? Was that sort of?
Yeah, I remember it all pretty well, actually. It was, I don't know, it was kind of a lot of confusion. I got taken to the local hospital to clean me and gave me antibiotics for saltwater sores and gave me some food. And, although I was starving, there wasn't really much else they could do for me. And this woman who worked in the hospital invited me home with her to her family, and they fed me more. There was a lot of eating involved in the first few days. Yeah. But then I got actually quite ill for a while. My system was not used to, especially, very hot Creole food and all that stuff. So the first couple of weeks was a big adjustment. I was gaining a lot of weight, mostly in water. It looked like I had elephantiasis. It was kind of a whole new, I don't know, survival voyage in its own right for a while. But I was well, and I did fine. And one thing that was amazing to me was that I was so naive, and I felt like I was really almost literally reborn. That all the colors and smells and everything were like I was just experiencing them for the first time. People's voices, everything. It was just an amazingly heavenly feeling, and a feeling of being at ease that I've never had before. Yeah. Probably since, in many ways, because I'd been on that knife edge for so long, and then suddenly it just all totally melted away.
Yeah. What did that whole experience teach you about, I guess, the human spirit?
Well, it certainly taught me that I was a lot stronger than I thought I could be. And that's very common with survivors that I've talked to. early on, you're kind of saying, oh my God, there's no way I can deal with this. But slowly but surely you put things together and almost everybody finds out that they're a lot more resilient than they think they are. The other thing it did for me was actually, it pointed out that very clearly that we go through things in our lives, and a lot of these experiences are awful in many ways, but there were a lot of they're also very potent experiences, spiritually and emotionally. And you see things that are great wonders that you could only experience by going through it. It might be just the amazing skies I saw, or it might be something more subtle, like just feeling this deep relationship with this fish upon which I depended for my very life. So I think it's also a very common thing with survivors to say, well, I don't want to go back there, but, I don't regret having gone through the experience.
A number of years later, you were approached by Ang Lee in the movie Life of Pi. Tell us about that, and what sort of advice and help did you provide Ang Lee and the makers of Life of Pi?
Well, Ang Lee was the fourth director to try to make Life of Pi. And before he committed himself to it, he as all his projects, he really looks into them. And he had a script writer, David McGee, whose son was reading Adrift and said, "Hey, Dad, if you're writing this script about this boy in a lifeboat in the middle of the Pacific, you should go look up this guy." Which they did, and so they came up here, and we just had a few days together, chats about everything from what kind of wildlife is there, general information about how the world works, how currents and weather and all these things work, details about lifeboats, all the nuts and bolts, as well as like. He was interested in things like, tell me about how do you feel spiritually at sea, and, tell me what it's really like, what it feels like, and that sort of thing. And then he went away, and a couple of years later, I got a call from the producer who said they got the green light. So I ended up going to Taiwan, and I did pre-production stuff, research, feeding images to the visual effects people, all that sort of thing, looking at the script in the storyboards, essentially, which is done in video form, is to say, give him my 2 cents worth, whether that looked realistic or not. My basic charge, as he said, was to help them try to make it look convincing, to feel convincing. Yeah. It's such a wacko story that we tried to make it as real as possible in as many ways as possible. And I ended up doing, directing wave tank operations, testing the wave tank, making and designing props, coaching the actor, working with pretty much all the departments there, which was great fun and a great challenge and a great privilege.
Now, just on advice, if you could give a listener out there some advice who's wanting to sail across an ocean, like the Atlantic Ocean, for example, is there any sort of one or two big tips or any advice that you could give a listener who's wanting to do that?
I don't know. Start small to start with. Small boats really teach you a lot. It's immediate feedback about what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and they're simple before you get up into really complicated things. And take things step by step, I guess, and see how you feel. See if you like it. See if you love it. I think that if you're going to do an offshore trip, you'd better love it. It'd be like, I don't know, if you're really going offshore, it's like climbing a major mountain. Could be like climbing an incredibly major mountain. You really are in the wilderness, and you're totally on your own. So you got to take it one step at a time.
Yeah. Now, your book, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, you can get that on Amazon, also Audible. Whereabouts can people find your website and your other sort of social media and stuff like that?
Oh, I have a website, stephencallahan.net.
Yeah.
And like I say, I'm not a young fellow like you probably are, and so I'm probably not as adept at all the social media as everybody else. I think I have a page on Facebook, but I'm not terribly good at keeping up with it. But I do have a website, and there's a lot more info about my background. There are articles on there and whatnot.
Yeah, well, I'll put a link to that and a link to your book as well. Appreciate you coming onto the podcast, and it's an incredible story, and it's been a real privilege speaking with you and hearing about what you've lived through. It's quite incredible.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I appreciate the opportunity of talking to you and all your listeners.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on.
All right. Cheers,
Thanks, Steve.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntokickarse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard and catch you next time.